In 1960, an archaeologist named Ralph Solecki was excavating a cave in northern Iraq called Shanidar when his team uncovered something that stopped everyone in the room. 9 Neanderthal skeletons, buried deliberately in a cave occupied over 60,000 years ago. That alone was significant. But it was what the soil analysis found around one of the skeletons that changed everything. Pollen. Enormous concentrations of flower pollen from at least 8 different species of flowering plants clustered directly around the bones. Grape hyacinth, groundsel, ephedra, species that still grow in that region today. Solecki's interpretation was immediate, and it sent a tremor through the entire field of paleoanthropology. Someone had laid flowers on this grave 60,000 years ago. A being that most scientists at the time considered barely human had buried one of its own and decorated that burial with flowers. The question that followed from that finding has not been fully answered in the 60 years since. What does it mean to bury your dead? And whatever it means, when did we start doing it? Because the answer to that question is also the answer to something much harder to excavate. When did we first feel something that deserved a name? Most people assume that grief is a modern emotion, something that came with language, with culture, with the cognitive complexity of fully developed human minds. The evidence buried in caves and hillsides across 3 continents suggests otherwise, and the oldest of that evidence does not belong to us. It belongs to people we spent most of history refusing to recognize as people at all. The oldest confirmed deliberate burial site belonging to anatomically modern humans was discovered at Kafsa Cave in Israel. The remains date to approximately 100,000 years ago. A child buried with the antlers of a fallow deer placed deliberately across the body. The positioning of the bones, the intentional placement of the grave goods, the orientation of the body, all of it indicates a burial that was not accidental, not hygienic, not simply a matter of removing a corpse from the living space. It was, by every measure archaeologists used to identify intentional burial, a ritual. Something was being done for the dead that served no immediate practical purpose for the living. That gap between practical necessity and deliberate action is where the most interesting question lives, because ritual requires something specific from the brain that performs it. It requires the ability to imagine a state of affairs that does not currently exist. It requires understanding that the person who is gone in a permanent way that demands a response. It requires, in other words, a relationship with death that goes beyond the immediate fact of a body. And that relationship is not possible without something that functions like grief. But then there is Shanidar. Because if the flowers were placed intentionally, and that is a significant if, then the timeline moves back not 100,000 years, but 60,000. And the species doing the burying is not Homo sapiens. It is Homo neanderthalensis, a species that most mid-20th century scientists classified as a brutish, barely conscious precursor to real humanity. The flower burial upended that classification so completely that it sparked a debate that has continued for 6 decades without resolution. In 1999, a researcher named Jeffrey Sommer proposed an alternative explanation for the pollen. A species of burrowing rodent, the Persian jerd, is known to store flowering plant material in underground nests. Shanidar Cave contains evidence of these rodents. The pollen concentrations, Sommer argued, could have been deposited by animals rather than placed by grieving hands. The debate has never been fully settled. Modern reanalysis of the Shanidar remains, conducted by a team from the University of Cambridge and published in 2020, found additional Neanderthal remains in the same location, with positioning that strongly suggested deliberate burial. But the flower question remains open, and the fact that it remains open tells you something important about how much is riding on the answer. Because if Neanderthals buried their dead with flowers, the first human emotion was not born in our species. It was inherited from a cousin we drove to extinction. Set aside the flower controversy for a moment and look at what is not contested. Neanderthals buried their dead. Multiple sites across Europe and the Middle East confirmed this with enough consistency that deliberate burial is no longer seriously disputed as a Neanderthal behavior. La Pharisee in France, Kibera Cave in Israel, Spy Cave in Belgium. At each of these sites, Neanderthal remains are found in positions and contexts that indicate intentional interment Bodies placed on their sides in a fetal position, grave pits dug to receive them, bones oriented in consistent directions. None of this is what you find when a body is simply left where it fell. Someone dug those graves. Someone put those bodies in them. Someone made a decision at the moment of loss to do something with the dead that required time and effort and served no survival purpose whatsoever. That decision is the artifact, and it is more revealing than any tool or bone fragment because it tells you something about the inner life of the mind that made it. To bury your dead deliberately, you need several things working together in your brain at the same time. You need to understand that death is permanent, that the individual who is gone will not return. This sounds obvious, but it is not cognitively trivial. Most animals respond to the death of companions with confusion, with continued attempts to rouse them, with proximity behavior that suggests an expectation of return. The response fades over time through habituation, not through understanding. To bury the dead, you need to understand finality. You also need to have formed an attachment to the individual that persists beyond their physical presence. You need to have a mental representation of who they were that survives their death and motivates action on their behalf. And you need the capacity to perform a behavior whose only beneficiary is someone who can no longer benefit from anything. These cognitive requirements are not small. They are collectively what distinguishes grief from the simpler distress responses seen in other social animals. Elephants return to the bones of their dead and touch them with their trunks. Chimpanzees have been documented carrying the bodies of their dead infants for days or weeks after death. Dolphins have been observed supporting the bodies of deceased companions at the water's surface. These behaviors suggest something. They suggest attachment, recognition of loss, a relationship with death that goes beyond indifference. But they stop short of burial. They stop short of the deliberate transformation of the environment in response to loss. That transformation is what the archaeological record is measuring when it finds a grave, and the record finds graves going back further than our species has existed. This brings us to the question that the burial sites are really asking, not when did humans start burying their dead, but why does losing someone hurt in the first place? Because grief is not obviously adaptive. An animal that is incapacitated by the loss of another animal, that stops eating, stops moving, stops functioning in the ways necessary for survival, is an animal at a disadvantage. The acute phase of grief, the phase that humans and possibly Neanderthals and possibly other species experience in the immediate aftermath of loss, looks from a pure survival standpoint like a catastrophic system failure. So why does evolution preserve it? The answer, developed across decades of research in evolutionary psychology and attachment theory, is that grief is not a malfunction. It is the price of attachment. And attachment in social species is the mechanism that makes cooperation possible. The bonds between individuals in a group, the relationships that motivate one individual to share resources with another, to protect another, to coordinate with another at personal cost, those bonds are what allow social species to function as units rather than as collections of competing individuals. Grief is what those bonds feel like when they are severed. It is the pain signal that tells you something essential to your survival architecture has been damaged. In a species that cannot survive alone, that signal is not a weakness. It is the proof that the bonds were real enough to matter. And bonds that matter are bonds that function. The grief is the cost of the thing that kept you alive. Which means the first burial was not just a ritual, it was evidence of a social structure sophisticated enough to produce attachments that survived death. Evidence that someone in that group had mattered enough to another member of the group that their absence required a response. That the response took the form of placing a body carefully in the ground, of perhaps laying flowers, of doing something deliberate and costly at the moment of maximum loss, tells you that the attachment was deep enough to motivate action even when the person who had motivated it was gone. That is what grief is, and the caves are full of its oldest evidence. Somewhere between 60 and 100,000 years ago, possibly longer, a being that was either us or close enough to us to matter knelt over someone they had lost and did something that served no purpose except to mark that the loss was real. That moment is the beginning of something, not the beginning of death. The beginning of the response to death that makes us what we are. You have felt it. Every person alive has felt it. The ones who felt it first left it in the ground for us to find. 60,000 years later, we are still asking the same question they were asking when they dug those graves. What do you do with the fact that someone was here and now they are not?